Hello everyone, I'm Maisee Short, and the article I chose was on child maltreatment and its impact on emotion regulation and how that differs or changes through adolescence and young adulthood. So previous research has shown that childhood maltreatment is linked to poor emotion regulation in childhood, but much less is known about how these difficulties develop over time. And so the authors wanted to examine how different types of childhood maltreatment, including abuse and neglect, would impact long-term developmental trajectories of emotion regulation. To test this, their hypothesis was that childhood abuse and neglect would predict higher initial levels of emotion regulation difficulties, greater use of suppression, and less use of cognitive reappraisal. As some background information, the authors stated that emotion regulation in early life is largely a learned behavior. They stated that early environment matters and that children typically learn regulation skills from the caregivers, such that supportive, emotionally responsive parents will model adaptive strategies, whereas abusive and neglectful parents often punish emotion expression and/or they'll model maladaptive regulation. In this study, emotion regulation is described as our attempt to influence what emotions are being experienced and how they are expressed. It's split into two categories: cognitive reappraisal, which is reinterpreting a situation to change its emotional impact, which is seen as an adaptive strategy, and the second category, which is expressive suppression, which is inhibiting emotional expressions, which is often seen as a maladaptive coping strategy. Abuse was described as inappropriate and harmful behavior towards a child, and neglect was the failure to attend to the basic needs of a child. This study has a strong connection to class because it builds upon the concept that our various systems, including the emotional, physical, and mental, they all develop at different speeds and time in life. In particular, this study emphasizes how emotional reactivity peaks at a time when cognitive systems are still developing. More specifically, they address this by investigating how early maltreatment might worsen this imbalance of systems that we're seeing, leading to more difficulty in managing emotions during a period when regulation skills are still developing. In class, we discuss these ideas and how adverse environments speed up the development of the brain, particularly in areas of threat detection. Our early experiences begin to shape our brain and help determine what needs pruned and what areas should connect. And I think these concepts can be applied to the focus of this research. The authors of this study conducted a longitudinal study with 6 different waves of data between the years of 2014 and 2021. They utilized 167 adolescents, 47% whom were female, and at time 1 of this study data collection, adolescents were between the ages of 13 and 14. And so this means by the end of the study, they are around the age of 20. Maltreatment was measured using Maisee, which is a retrospective self-report of abuse and neglect between the ages of 1 and 18. Emotion regulation difficulties were measured using DARES, with higher scores equaling greater difficulties in controlling one's emotions. And then reappraisal and suppression was measured using the ERQ. The ERQ gains insight into an individual's use of reappraisal and suppression specifically, whereas the difficulties in emotion regulation scale concentrates on one's ability to regulate emotions more generally. Lastly, analyses were conducted using a conditional growth curve modeling system to track individual changes over time and to test how maltreatment predicted different growth trajectories of emotions. So the results showed that emotion regulation difficulties overall did not change much across adolescents, but there were individual differences found. Abuse, not neglect, predicted increasing emotion regulation difficulties across adolescents and into young adulthood. And then the last 2 bullet points I have here are based off of different hypotheses, but I still wanted to show you what the authors found. Looking at Table 2, we can see that abuse and neglect were correlated with difficulties in emotion regulation at time 1, which agrees with previous findings that maltreatment impacts childhood emotional development. At time 2, we can see that abuse is correlated with reappraisal strategies, and then neither abuse nor neglect had any significant relationship on suppression. In Table 3, beta is a significant value. We see that it is increasing positively across all the time spans, meaning that maltreatment is positively associated with difficulties in emotional regulation, and by time 6, we have quite a strong positive relationship. And then to add to that, this bulleted line here, shows us that abuse is significant to changes across emotion regulation difficulties and not neglect. Thank you all for watching, and I can't wait to read your responses and see what you've learned about childhood maltreatment and its impact on emotion regulation across adolescence and early adulthood.